Good evening. You should know that Dr. Fairlie has gone a considerable way out of his way to be able to share with us this evening. It's tomorrow morning for him right now because he's just come from England. And I'd like to start by saying a great welcome to fellow Canadian Dr. Fairlie, who's, let's do that right now. If you want to delve into this a bit more, it's a very, very extensive coverage of many, many issues, and he'll be speaking to these issues this evening, so I won't say more about that. But I would like to tell you that he was prevailed upon to come here as a result of our knowing that if there was any chance of him coming to Canada, that we'd like to engage him in sharing his quite deep and extensive knowledge of radiation. His background is in chemistry and radiation biology. His doctorate was a study of the effects of radiation around the Sellafield plant in England and Cap La Hague in France. And he did was a nuclear consultant for Greenpeace Canada, and as well as being the secretary of the committee for and I'm going to have to read this just to make sure I got it right, the committee examining radiation risks of internal emitters. And that will be explained to you, the importance of understanding internal emitters in dealing with radiation. Now, just as a personal note, I'd like to share with you a paper that he tipped me off to, and I also recommend you go do a web search for his name if you want to get some of the other papers. But he very recently did a paper which, to me, was if you want to get a basic understanding of epidemiology and how you approach some of these issues in a scientific way, I really highly recommend his paper, Hypothesis to Explain Childhood Leukemias Near Nuclear Power Stations, which also has a very extensive bibliography to it, including how to access the studies that were done in Germany, the so-called KIC studies. And I won't say more because really the issues will be dealt with extensively in this talk, which you see by this title. Only to say that a true scientist puts out a hypothesis and tests what is the evidence that will affirm or disprove this hypothesis, rather than I have a policy and how can I shape the information so that it, circular arguments. Some few of you may have done some philosophy and understand that that's invalid circular argument. So I won't say more other than to say it's a great honor to just be able to say a few words by way of introduction to Dr. Ian Fairlie, who I regard as an exemplary paramount scientist on these issues.
As always, technology fails you at the last moment.
I might just say that, well, in this pause, of course, we're all very aware of what's happening in Japan as we speak. And to understand some of what's happening there and not just a Japan, but a global crisis, having Dr. Fairlie to speak to this will be very important.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that very warm introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be back in Canada again. I lived here for many years. When I was a young lad, went to high school in Sarnia. And when Bill and Dale said, would I come over, I jumped at the opportunity, and I'm very pleased to be here. Perhaps I should really give you a slightly deeper understanding of where I'm coming from. I was a government scientist for many years, working for the UK's Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in their radiation department. Worked for about 15 years with them. culminating with being the scientific secretary to a ministerial committee, the one, Cherry committee, the one that Bill referred to. And I retired back in 2005. They put me out to grass, I was getting too old and decrepit. By golly, if I was like that 6 years ago, I'd be thinking of what I feel like now. But what happened was in 2008, a very famous study came out which totally changed my views about childhood leukemias near nuclear power stations. And I'm going to come on to that in a minute. When I was invited by Dale, she said, what shall we talk about? And, she said, shall we say deconstructing the health effects of nuclear facilities? And I like that, so I said, yeah, I'll put it in the title. And I toyed around with it, so I'm going to talk about that for a few minutes. But before I do that, I want to say that we're now talking in the middle of probably the world's worst nuclear disaster. My own private view is that it at least equals the severity of Chernobyl and probably exceeds it. We have an ongoing situation where 4 reactors and their cooling ponds are in deep trouble. There's been 3 hydrogen explosions and 2 fires in the fuel ponds above 2 of the reactors, 3 and 4. There's been meltdowns in at least 1 of the reactors, probably 2. And a number of my nuclear physics colleagues in the UK think that there have been criticality incidents. In other words, on our way to nuclear weapons type incidents. They're not quite nuclear weapons, but they are situations where there's vast amounts of energy released in a second when you have critical masses. Not like a bomb, there's no moderators, but it's still serious. A situation whereby over 200,000 people have been evacuated from the immediate area, where the nationals from every single European countries have been evacuated from Tokyo, hundreds of chartered flights in yanking all the Europeans out, where there has been an absolute lack of candor and transparency from the Japanese authorities. And yet, this ongoing disaster is occurring right in front of our TV screens every day. And what do the Japanese authorities do? They mumble their way through evasions, equivocations, deceptions, untruths. It's absolutely shocking. In my view, the Japanese authorities are a disgrace to themselves, their countries, and their compatriots, their own countrymen. That said, we shouldn't pour the obloquy on their heads alone, because there's a number of premiers, like the Prime Minister of my country, where I'm living right now, and the Prime Minister of the United States, and the Premier of France, have all said, oh, no, the Japanese disaster is not going to deflect us in our chosen paths for nuclear power. Those people, those presidents and premiers, also are unworthy of their titles and positions. But I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about chronic long-term exposures rather than sudden blasts or sudden accidents. And for a long time, the evidence has been slotted up so that there is no question of any possibility of anything going wrong or any ill health effects from the nuclear power stations, particularly in Europe. Next slide, please. Back in 2002, there was a very famous Downing Street memo. It's been published. The New York Review of Books in 2006 actually reproduced parts of it. That's where I got it. And this was concerning, these were talks inside Downing Street, the home of the Prime Minister of Britain, about an impending US-UK attack on Iraq. And the head of the MI6 acting the intelligence services, like sort of like the national security office in the United States. The head of that service was called M. Stated that the intelligence and the facts were being fixed around the policy. That's what he said. There's a direct quote, and you can actually read what he said. This is the top head of the UK intelligence saying this. And I thought, hey, that's exactly what's happening here with radiation and nuclear power. They're fitting up the evidence around the pre-existing policy. And that's exactly what they do. However, the government in Britain has said repeatedly, no. Our scientific policies are led by the best available evidence. And indeed, I've parroted those words myself. I squirm with embarrassment, but I've said those things in the past myself as being a government spokesman when I worked for the UK government. Next slide here. For many years, there has been evidence suggestive that there is increased incidences of leukemias near nuclear power stations. However, particularly in Britain and in France, there's been very strong denial of this. They don't want that evidence. It doesn't fit with their policies. However, after the KIC study, and I'll come back to it in a minute, there is very clear evidence now. I'll come to that in a minute. But the chief scientists throughout the world, the radiation scientists, that's the ICRP, CMSC, NRC, HPA, UNSCARE, you name it, VR7, continue to deny that there is any link between nuclear facilities and increased leukemias. And one of the reasons that they can get away with it is because there are too few scientists who stand up and say, that's not true. There are some wonderful exceptions. One of the best is Dr. Helen Caldecott, and I consider her to be one of the best people for getting up and saying no to the government. But I'm hoping that there will be more in the future. Next slide. The ways that the governments get away with it is that they deny, ignore, downplay the evidence. They, on the other hand, they emphasize contrary but poor evidence. They use weasel words. For example, the latest UNSCARE report on the effects of Chernobyl says there's no persuasive evidence. Well, persuasive to who? Because, I mean, if you look at it, and they actually they are slightly fair in the sense that they put out a lot of evidence, but at the end of it all say, no, it's not persuasive. In other words, it's one of those situations whereby the scientists all put all together, the evidence together, which is incredible in many ways. It's very weighty, but along comes a political into the top who says, and the concluding chapter says, not persuasive. In other words, political control, making sure that the message gets across that all that evidence is to be discounted. And that happens quite a bit. They use statistical tests. I'm a radiation biologist, not an epidemiologist. Epidemiology is the study of human disease in human populations. It's a bit of a black art. There's no such thing as a science of epidemiology. It's a sort of a growing thing. But one of the things I found out when I was speaking to epidemiologists in other areas, like, for example, biological toxins or chemical toxins or viruses, they said, there's something weird going on with radiation. You guys screw up every time when it comes to the studies that you do on the effects of radiation. I said, hang on, I don't do the studies. I'm a biologist. I'm the guy who works in the lab, injecting stuff into little animals. I used to do that. One of the things I found out when I said, well, I'm going to have to go back to the drawing board and learn how to do epidemiology, and I found out that, in fact, it's a stack of lies. Honestly, it's just ridiculous. One of the biggest ones to do is that they often do epidemiological studies, which will find that there will be an increase, and they'll say, because there's a greater than 5% chance that this is going to occur just by the laws of chance,